My lady, may we have, please, Dr. G.N. Shin sworn, Professor Dinah Gold sworn, and Dr. Ben Warren sworn.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Stand and repeat after me, please. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
That the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
Well, the three of you are all right, and I'm sorry, the box isn't intended for threesomes, but...
Thank you. Can I introduce all three of you in turn? Can I start with you, Dr. Shin? I believe you are the Director of Infection Prevention and Control at UCLH in London, informally known as a DIPSI, if I can introduce some of more acronyms. You are a consultant virologist at University College Hospitals Foundation Trust and have been so since 2018, is that right? I think during the pandemic, you were interim DIPSI, and then since 2021 have been continuously in that role. Would you mind saying yes?
Yes.
Thank you, so that anyone who's following it online can hear, and indeed our stenographer who's off-site.
That is all correct.
Thank you. I think you were heavily involved in many aspects of the COVID response of the Trust, and you are also a member of the UK Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens, is that correct?
That's correct.
We may come to HSIDS later. You've worked for Public Health England formally between 2013 and 2018 and have co-authored various COVID papers. And can I ask you, during the pandemic, were you working on the wards in the hospital or in the background, as it were?
I was working in non-clinical areas.
All right, okay. Professor Gould, may I come to you? You are a registered nurse and nurse educator, is that correct? I think you taught for many years the scientific aspects of the curriculum to undergraduate nurses and other health professionals. You've undertaken a PhD exploring hand hygiene, use of PPE, and other matters. You've conducted research into how IPC is taught in the undergraduate programmes. And indeed, at one stage, you belonged to a group known as the Cochrane Effective Practice and Organisation of Care Group, and you were on the World Health Organisation's Technical Advisory Group for Hand Hygiene.
That's correct, and I'm still on those two groups.
Thank you. Can I ask you about your role during the pandemic? Is this right, that as we entered the pandemic, you were not in fact on the nursing register, is that correct?
I was on the temporary nursing register.
Right. Did you make efforts, we've heard a little bit about that, did you make efforts to go back onto the temporary register once there was the call out for assistance?
Yes, as soon as the call came out, because I'd only just come off the permanent register. So I went back on the temporary register as soon as it was possible.
Thank you. Were you in fact deployed during the pandemic?
No, I would like to have been, but I was never asked to.
Right.
So I did work in the background.
All right. Did they tell you why you weren't able to be deployed?
No, I never received any information individually from the Nursing and Midwifery Council, just generic emails.
All right, thank you. Dr. Warren, finally to you. You are a consultant in infectious diseases and general medicine at Cambridge University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust, is that correct?
That's correct.
You trained as a registrar in infectious diseases from 2015 to 2024 and have recently finished a post as an academic clinical lecturer in infectious diseases at the Department of Medicine at Cambridge University.
That's correct.
Right. I think during 2017 to 2021, you were a clinical research fellow at the university using pathogen genomics to study common infectious diseases of public health significance. What did you do, Dr. Warren?
So it was using genomics and traditional epidemiology to study important pathogens, including influenza and SARS-CoV-2, and how they spread in hospitals, as well as antibiotic resistance mechanisms.
And of significance to us, I think during 2020 to 2021, that academic year, you were the clinical lead for the university's asymptomatic COVID-19 screening programme.
That's correct.
And may I ask you about your time during the pandemic? Did you work on the front line, if I may put it like that?
So during the first wave of the pandemic, I went back to the hospital to work on preparations for the pandemic, guidelines, etc. But I wasn't a frontline clinician for the majority of that time. I continued to do out-of-hours on-call work from June 2020 and then returned back to full-time clinical work at the end of 2021 when I was caring for COVID patients directly.
Right, okay, thank you very much. May I start actually where we normally end up and ask you, please, in turn, for a headline recommendation. And I'd like, if you may, just to tell us what it is, briefly why, and I suspect as we go through your evidence, the reasons why I hope will become more obvious. But can I start with you, Dr. Shin? If you could recommend one thing for Her Ladyship to consider that might help in the event of a future pandemic, what would it be?
It would be really important to review and improve the NHS estate, particularly in ventilation and isolation capacity. The reason why this is important is because in facing any epidemic or future pandemic, if the legacy inadequacies of our NHS estate across the country, which in some places is very old, if that is not improved, we will face the next emergency with the same difficulties that we encountered this COVID pandemic.
Thank you. Professor Gould.
I think that throughout the 4 nations of the UK, we should have guidelines for infection prevention and control that everybody knows about, that everybody can access, that people believe in and want to put in place and can put in place and understand why they're doing it.
Thank you. And Dr. Warne.
So I'd advocate for the rapid and expansion of testing capacity in the UK, both for testing symptomatic people and asymptomatic individuals. In the event that we have another pandemic which involves any kind of asymptomatic transmission, it is vitally important for infection control that we know who those individuals are, and that requires expansive different types of testing capacity, and also that the results of that are linked to large national databases so we can properly understand and address the problem.
We heard the chief nursing officers, for different reasons, advocate for the same thing when they gave evidence. Can I just deal with your report? Helpfully, you have divided up the task between you, and there are lead authors for various parts of the chapters, and it will be to those that I turn and ask you to respond to. Can I urge you not to all jump in, no matter how tempting it may be? But if there are important matters after the lead author has given their answers, feel free then to perhaps add different perspectives to the matters that we will be examining. And I think you make the observation that, broadly speaking, between the three of you, your expertise covers IPC, nursing, education and training, obviously infectious diseases, public health virology and managing those outbreaks. And you've written about matters within your collective experience and expertise. And I think you've also seen Professor Beggs's report, and he likewise had seen yours. Also this, just so that you know, we've been referring to it as COVID rather than SARS-CoV-2. If you can manage to do that, that would be greatly appreciated. May I turn to you, Dr. Shin, firstly, for a brief summary of how pre-pandemic respiratory viruses impacted the healthcare. So we have an overview of where we were before we entered and then what happened when we got into the pandemic. And if it helps you, I'm at paragraph 1.5 in your report.
Thank you. So the NHS is used to seeing a seasonal winter challenge from multiple respiratory viruses, particularly respiratory syncytial virus, influenza or flu, A and B, each winter, and also some other non-respiratory viruses like norovirus, which causes a gastrointestinal illness. And this occurs very regularly and predictably every winter, approximately in that order. And this causes a major challenge for acute parts of NHS hospitals, emergency department, our acute wards, sometimes intensive care, and of course all of these have infection prevention control, IPC challenges to them, which we are reasonably well practiced in dealing with. Part of the response includes a preemptive seasonal flu vaccination program for all staff, for vulnerable patients in the population, diagnostics and preparing pathways for these kinds of patients.
Let me pause you there. Can I just ask you, we've not actually looked at RSV, respiratory, how do I pronounce the second word?
Syncytial.
Syncytial virus. What is RSV?
It's a common, globally distributed virus, which particularly affects young children, infants, and also we now know older adults and adults with chronic lung disease. And it can lead to hospitalization, in some cases intensive care, and sadly globally, it does cause thousands of deaths globally. In the UK, that's less common.
All right. So there is a background of dealing with the flu epidemics that hit us most winters.
Yes.
You mentioned there that the vaccine take-up can affect the impact of the flu vaccine on the numbers in hospital. I think you also say weather, social distancing, the mutation of the particular flu virus, they all depend on how badly hit the hospitals are. Is that correct?
Yes. So the severity of each winter's flu epidemic does vary year to year, and that is affected by multiple factors. For example, the characteristics of the virus strain, how well matched the virus is to the vaccine uptake, and many other factors which won't go into too much detail here. But it does vary year to year. Some years are very severe, some years less so. You mentioned social distancing. Actually, with flu, we don't traditionally apply social distancing that much. That's something which is a feature of this pandemic.
Right. Can I pause you there? Because I think you make the point in your report that during the winter of 2020 into 2021, the non-pharmaceutical interventions actually suppressed flu cases that year.
Yes, I think that was a general observation that in that winter, the first winter of the pandemic, COVID really dominated, and we saw most of the other viruses in far lower frequency than we did before. And that's probably linked to, for example, lockdown and the various public health restrictions that influenced that significantly. But it was a remarkable change in epidemiology in that winter.
And I think you say that regular infection prevention and control challenges of dealing with RSV, for example, flu and TB, meant the NHS had some experience of IPC countermeasures. Was that isolation, cohorting, those kind of things?
All of those, and PPE.
And PPE.
Can you just say in one sentence what cohorting means for those who haven't followed?
So cohorting, when you have sufficient numbers of a case of, for example, cases of, for example, flu, then you can put them into a bay or indeed a ward if it gets that many. And many trust hospitals would have had, for example, a flu ward. In paediatrics, it was common to have an RSV ward because when you have sufficient numbers, and that area then becomes, an infection area, which is dealt with differently to other wards.
We are familiar with some IPC definitions, but Professor Gould, can I ask you about the World Health Organization's definition of IPC? And I think you set it out in your report as follows. The World Health Organization defines IPC as practical, evidence-based approach preventing patients and healthcare workers from being harmed by avoidable infections. A fairly common sense definition, if I may put it like that. Do you agree?
Yes, that's correct.
We've heard a little about source control, and is this right? It means preventing the spread of infection from an individual who is known or suspected to be a potential source of infection. And that can include things like having the infected person in a single room, isolating them, decontaminating the room or the ward, and using masks.
That would be correct.
All right, thank you. PPE we're familiar with. I won't ask you about that. You do help in your report, though, and if it helps you, Professor Gould, at paragraph 1.18, in relation to the makeup of IPC teams, I think you say that there are specialist teams employed in most countries in the UK. Can you just tell us who makes up an IPC team?
The infection control team will be led either by a doctor or a nurse. It will consist of usually a medical microbiologist. It will include a virologist. It will include specialist nurses. It will probably include nurses who are specifically engaged in surveillance and audit. It will very likely, particularly in a large NHS trust, would involve nurses who particularly have an educational role. And people will be co-opted onto the team in the case of particular need. So if there was an outbreak of food poisoning, for example, the catering staff would be there, but they wouldn't be there all of the time.
Understood.
If there was a problem with ventilation, then the hospital engineers would be there. So there's a core team, and there will be additional people as well.
You mention in your report what are called IPC link nurse schemes. What are they, please?
infection prevention and control link nurses are members of the general ward team, so they would be a member of the team who looked after patients or worked in an outpatient department in the usual way, but they would have an additional responsibility. They would act as ambassadors for infection prevention and control. They would have a liaison role. They would provide the communication channels between the infection prevention specialist team and ordinary people on the wards, and they would usually have some particular education or training for that. Not every organisation will have them,
I was going to
but
ask.
many do.
Are they across only England or UK-wide?
Oh, they would be UK-wide.
Thank you. Right. And can we look at perhaps the arrangements for the leadership of IPC teams across the 4 nations? I think obviously in England there is the director, the DIPSI, as Dr. Shin is. In Scotland, they have the leader of the IPC team is called the Infection Control Manager. Is that correct? In Wales, leadership for IPC is undertaken by a senior nurse with expertise in IPC. And in Northern Ireland, I think you say in the report we couldn't locate any publicly available information on IPC team leadership for Northern Ireland.
I looked as far as I could, but I could find nothing in writing, and I have no contacts in Northern Ireland, whereas I worked in Wales for 8 years. So I have contacts in Wales, I have contacts in England, I do have some contacts in Scotland, but I have no contact in Northern Ireland to ask.
Whatever nomenclature is given to the person in charge leading the team, does effectively the director, the manager, and the senior nurse with expertise in Wales, are they all performing roughly the same function, do you know?
They're performing roughly the same function, but their remit would vary a little bit, because in Wales they have health boards instead of NHS trusts, and the health boards would include some community staff as well. So the nurse in charge would have a community role, whereas somebody in a large NHS trust would have a role just to do with the acute trust.
Thank you. I ask you this because there is a query by those who represent the Welsh bereaved as to whether the absence of a DIPSI, a director in Wales, might have detrimentally affected implementation of IPC guidance. Are you able to opine on that?
Well, when I worked in Wales between 2012 and 2019. And Wales is a small country, and that is advantageous because you can know people in it the way you can't in a larger country. I used to go to a lot of meetings to do with infection prevention specialists, and I would say that the quality of the service that was offered by the people in charge of the services was very good. The fact that they didn't have the title of DIPSI didn't make any difference. They performed the same role.
And perhaps a question for you, Dr. Shin. In practice, does your oversight of IPC matters include consideration of non-clinical staff as well as clinical staff?
It is, yes, it includes, my role is really to protect the patient and staff safety. For the staff safety side, it includes all staff, clinical and non-clinical, if that's what you're asking.
Thank you. Slightly different matter, the characteristics of COVID. And for you, Dr. Warren, we've heard from Professor Begg, so we're familiar with contact, direct, indirect, fomite, call it what you will, droplet and aerosols. I won't ask you about that, but can I ask you just very briefly about transmissibility and the reproduction number? I suspect her ladyship's heard about this in earlier modules, but for the purposes of module 3, could you just help us, please, with how transmissibility is commonly expressed as the R number?
Absolutely. So in terms of infection control measures, the transmissibility is a key feature of consideration for when you're thinking about infection control measures. So the R number is the number of, if you have an infected individual, it's the number of people in a vulnerable population you would be expected to be infected coming into contact with that person. So for COVID, early in the pandemic, the estimate was that it was around 2.5 and up for other pathogens that can vary. It's roughly the same number for influenza and other respiratory viruses. It's far higher for conditions like measles, lower for tuberculosis and so on, and that influences the control measures we would take.
Yeah. I think you say there in your report that it's important to note that the transmissibility, or the R value, is an estimate, and the true transmissibility depends on the setting.
Exactly right. So the R0 is quoted quite commonly in population-level studies, but obviously the individual circumstances in which a patient finds themselves on the ward, in hospitals, that will influence the R number, the transmissibility, if the pathogen has an opportunity to spread, and there are different ways to facilitate that.
Is there a higher or lower R number in the hospital settings?
It could potentially be higher. It really depends on the setting. So if you were to put a patient isolated into a side room, the R number in principle would be lower. But we don't really think about the R number in terms of these individual settings. It's more of a population level measure.
And some other terminology we might be considering throughout your evidence. The infection fatality rate, please. What is that?
It's the number of people who get the infection who subsequently died. So it's the true number. So the problem we have with COVID is that we know that there are a number of people who are asymptomatic, where they're never identified as being a true case. The difficulty there is it's very difficult to always identify all of the asymptomatic cases, so they're often not included when you're quoting rates of infection. More commonly quoted would be the case fatality rate, which is...
Yeah. Slow down a tiny bit, please.
Okay.
Tell us about that.
So the case fatality is where you have confirmed cases, where you know that you have the infection. So that doesn't include asymptomatic individuals. But it's much easier to get that information from nationally collected data on confirmed cases, confirmed infections.
Thank you. And for our purposes, hospitalization fatality rate.
So this is the proportion of people who are hospitalised with COVID who subsequently died. Again, that's only a subset of all the people who catch COVID, is the ones in hospital.
And I think you go on to say, look in your report into the fatality rate, and there's a graph I'd like us to put up on screen. Can I have, please, INQ 474282 _18, already there? Thank you very much. Now, you'll have to help me, Dr. Warren, with this. What does the top graph show, and what is the point that is trying to be depicted by this graph?
So the top graph shows the hospitalisation fatality rate. So this is the proportion of people with COVID in hospital who subsequently die.
Right.
So we can see that with the purple line, that's the original variant of the virus.
You've called it wild type, but is that what came out in January to March 2020?
Exactly right.
Right.
Yeah. You can see that the hospitalisation fatality rate peaks at over 40%. So over 40% of people hospitalised with COVID in that time would have died.
So that is, yes, thank you very much. That's April 2020 there. Then it falls throughout the summer, effectively. The dotted line running down, what does that signify?
So that's the point at which the vaccination campaign was launched in the UK, so in December 2020.
Thank you. And then we can see it rise slightly. Then there's an emergence of a black line on the graph, which I think you say is the weighted indicator. What's the weighted indicator?
So at this point, we have two variants circulating in the UK at the same time. The original wild-type virus and the emergence of the alpha variant. And that black weighted line shows the combination of those two as the wild-type numbers went down and the alpha numbers went up.
And then if we look at alpha, just before December 2020, the hospitalisation fatality rate is at 40%, and then begins to drop as we pass through 2021. And then we get to June or thereabouts 2021 and the emergence of Delta. Now that's got a lot lower hospital fatality rate. Can you help as to why that is?
So you've noticed before that there are two waves of alpha.
Oh, yes.
The alpha hospitalisation fatality rate falls. There are multiple reasons. Probably the most important was the introduction of vaccination, as well as other things, including effective treatments for COVID that weren't there previously. But vaccination is probably the most important.
Right. And then it rises slightly, and then towards the end of December 2021 into February 2022, we've got the emergence of Omicron.
Yeah, so each of these variants have lower fatality rates associated with them.
Going back to the beginning then, in April 2020, can you help at all as to why the hospitalisation fatality rate is as high as it is in April 2020?
So it's a number of things. First, we have an unvaccinated population, all of whom were vulnerable to the infection. The virus itself was probably more pathogenic. It was more likely to cause severe disease and death. So the Omicron variant is very different in that regard to the original wild-type virus, as well as other factors, including an absence of effective treatment. And there are differences in the patient populations that were admitted, but they're all contributing.
All right. And then the bottom graph, please, is the effective infection fatality rate. what is that graph demonstrating to us?
This is all of the people, an estimate of all of the people that were infected with COVID, what proportion of those ultimately died. So it peaked at just over 1% with the wild type early in the pandemic, but like the graph above it, each subsequent wave of virus appeared to have a lower fatality rate, so fewer people died with subsequent variants.
I think you make the observation in your report that obviously if you are asymptomatic or indeed minimally symptomatic, don't feel that unwell if I can put it like that, you can still transmit the virus, as we've heard. You say this: the proportion of asymptomatic infections varies depending on the immune status of the individual, but a meta-analysis of studies published in 2020 estimated this figure at approximately 1/3 of all cases in unvaccinated individuals. Can you just put that into layman's terms for us?
So meta-analysis is where you take multiple studies and group them together to try and get a better idea of an estimate of a number. So that number of roughly 1/3 of people from different studies with different methods come to this conclusion that roughly 1 in 3 people who catch COVID are asymptomatic. So the relevance of that for IPC is it means that anybody coming into your hospital who don't have any symptoms may be carrying COVID.
Yeah. So
they may be potentially capable of spreading the virus.
Yeah, so before testing, it's almost impossible to work out if the person is infectious or not.
Exactly right.
Incubation periods we did briefly look at with Professor Beggs, but I think you say there that data from the pandemic showed the incubation period was from time to catching the virus to developing symptoms, anything between 1 and 14 days. So you could be asymptomatic for as long as 2 weeks.
Exactly right.
But the average was 5 days. Yes. Right. Again, presenting a problem for visitors, patients, staff alike coming into hospitals.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you could potentially be in hospital for 2 weeks before you, having caught the virus in the community, and potentially spread it from that point onwards, which is very difficult to try and work out from an infection control point of view where that infection originally came from.
Now, there was knowledge, as we know, of asymptomatic infections being possible early on, and evidence emerging as we went through the pandemic about the role of asymptomatic transmission. But do you think that future guidance should assume there will be asymptomatic transmission unless and until the contrary is proven?
Absolutely. So we know that there is asymptomatic transmission of a range of respiratory viruses, including influenza, including RSV. I think that there is much less with SARS and with MERS prior. But until proven otherwise, I think we should assume that there will be a substantial proportion of asymptomatic transmission.
And are you saying, Dr. Warren, that that should have been the case given the state of knowledge when the pandemic hit us?
So we knew that there were high rates of asymptomatic influenza, and although we discussed before in this inquiry about the importance of preparing for an influenza rather than a coronavirus pandemic, the likelihood that you have asymptomatic influenza is equally likely. So I think that we should definitely have been preparing for it and should prepare for it in a future pandemic.
Thank you.
We have become familiar with standard IPC measures and transmission-based precautions, but can I just ask you this? I'm asked to ask you about Professor Beggs's conclusion that hand hygiene has a modest effect in preventing COVID-19 transmission, and whether, I think probably you, Professor Gould, agree with that conclusion, or any of you if you disagree with it. Start with you, Professor.
I would agree with it. Direct contact was not found to be not considered to be the major route of spread. So hand hygiene is always going to be important, but would not, in this case, be the major route.
Dissent from either of you two gentlemen?
No, I agree with that.
I agree, but I think the last few words there is important, that IPC is not just about COVID, obviously, so we have to be conscious of all the other infectious threats. For that reason, hand hygiene is extremely important, as Professor Gould has just said. So I broadly agree with that small caveat.
Could I just add, we would be concerned with the spread of COVID, but we wouldn't want inadvertently to give the patients MRSA or any other infection. So hand hygiene is always good.
It's always important. Yeah.
Can I just check what your final word was, because I missed it and I think the stenographer missed it. Professor Gould, you said hand hygiene is important, but not, I think I know what the word was, but...
It wasn't the major.
Major, thank you.
Route.
Thank you. I we are familiar with airborne contact, droplet and the likes. I won't ask you to go through those again. Can I just ask you about FRSMs, though? Is this right, that they have effectively sometimes a dual role as source control and or as PPE? Is that a fair way of putting it?
I think they are used in source control. For example, historically in operating theatre, surgeons would wear them to protect the patient from, and especially the operating field, from any droplets from the surgeon. They can be used. They're not technically PPE.
Yes, we know.
But they are deployed in that way. So that's more important distinction. They have been used as a form of PPE, but officially and technically they're not classified as PPE.
Understood, save that all the IPC guidance talks about them in the context of PPE, but we take the technical distinction that there is. For these purposes, it obviously can protect you from getting blood on you if someone is bleeding, but equally, if you're coughing and sneezing, it can help prevent the larger droplets going out into the environment.
Yes, as I think there's a number of witnesses have said in written and verbal that any form of face covering provides some protection. So FRSMs can provide modest protection for the wearer.
Thank you. And dealing with masks and respirators, we're familiar with FFP3. Can I just ask about FFP2 or N95, as it's also been referred to? Is that a type of mask that is commonly used in the UK? Perhaps is that to you, Dr. Shin? Or you, Dr. Warren?
I can start. So FFP2 or N95 is commonly used in other countries, notably the United States, but some European countries. It is available in the United Kingdom, but we don't have any tradition in the NHS of using FFP2. We tend to use FFP3 because it provides a slightly higher level of protection.
I think in the report it says the type of respirator is designed to reduce the exposure of the wearer to respiratory particles by 95% when properly fit tested compared to no mask. Is that correct?
I think for FFP3 maybe higher than 95%. So FFP2 is also known as N95. I think that's where the figure comes from. But I think we're talking about fine margins here.
Fine. Whether it's FFP2 or FFP3, it provides a higher level of protection than wearing no mask at all. Understood.
Yeah, I think that's clearly true.
Thank you. All right. Now, fit testing. Can I ask about that, please? There are two ways, as I understand it, of fit testing. And is this a matter that you can help us with, Professor Gould? Or is it for you, Dr. Warren?
I'm happy to talk to it or Dr. Shin. Yep.
Either of you.
Good test. Yep. Sure.
Help us with what is quantitative fit testing, and it's at paragraph 1.59.
So there are two main methods of conducting fit testing, which is a requirement by the Health and Safety Executive before using FFP3 as PPE. The qualitative method requires the user to, once having donned a well-fitting respirator, to show that when a scent, for example, is placed close to the user, that they cannot detect that scent, which means that there's a good seal and protection, and those particles cannot breach that PPE. That's suitable for low volume usage. But in a
Do you mean when lots of people don't need it to be fit tested?
When you only have to test a few people, basically, and there's no real urgency. That's a reasonable approach, and one which my hospital used, for example. But in the context of an emergency like pandemic, we have to scale up fit testing to a very, very massive degree. Then that becomes impractical. And there's a method called the quantitative method, which uses complex equipment, and you need trained personnel to do that. And that is a method which is more easily scalable for this pandemic situation, for example. And most trusts would use that method.
Can I ask, what about the person who may not have a sense of smell? How is fit testing conducted in those circumstances?
I think that would need the quantitative method, and the qualitative method relying on scent detection would in that case clearly not work. Which the irony is that, as we know, COVID produced anosmia or loss of sense of smell in a number of people, so And that was another reason why the quantitative method, needing specialist equipment, was favoured.
And just help me, is this specialist equipment available in most hospitals? Are you able to give us an indication about how widely available it is?
I don't know specifically, but I can give you a best guess. My best guess is that most trusts probably didn't have this equipment, or if they did, at very, only one or two examples. So I suspect during the pandemic, most hospitals would have had to purchase more equipment and or outsource. There were some companies which could do this as an outsourced service.
And you need people available to train, trained people available to do the fit test.
Absolutely.
Yeah, all right. The fit test results, as I understand it, have to be recorded. Is that correct?
Well, they should be.
Should be.
If you want to have a robust process, once again, the logistical aspects of all of this is very important. If you don't have a proper record, then you can't, as an employer, you can't get assurance. As a member of staff, you can't get assurance that you know exactly which mask fits you, and that you need that mask available. So you have records for many reasons. The hospital has to assure itself that sufficient numbers of staff in relevant areas have been fit tested, and it's also need a record for the staff that we know for those staff they need this type of mask. For these staff, you need that type of mask. Yeah. So accurate records, I would suggest, are really quite important.
Help us. How long does it take to do a fit test?
Approximately 15 minutes. 15, 20 minutes. And the difficulty there is that if you don't pass on one type of mask, you then need to have tested on another type of mask. So that adds to the time. Understood.
We are familiar that fit checking is a different process. And is this right? It's effectively designed to check the seal.
Yes, that's just once you've found a mask which fits that person, they use that particular type of mask, don it, and there's just, I think, basically breathing in to make sure you feel that there's a seal and there's no air leakage.
Yeah, thank you. Now, may I ask you, please, Dr. Shin, about a document INQ 427339, please, page 5. I just want to look at some of the practicalities of how they played out. Now, this is a document from Leicester NHS Trust, and it's dated the 30th of April. And in short, it sets out some of the challenges that trust was going through in fit testing their staff and what they did to try and deal with that, and a proposal that they made. So that's the background. And I think if we just look there at 3.0, what has changed, the Trust was saying to the board that the NHS supply chain has been unable to provide a consistent stock of masks. In practice, this means we've had very limited stock of FFP3 on which staff have previously been tested. Under the current supply chain conditions, no trust has any control over the types of mask that are provided. Due into that, you might have type A mask one week and then type B mask comes in next week, and no one's been fit tested on the type B mask. All right.
That is possible.
Public Health England guidance has changed a number of times in recent weeks and has meant we have had used up some supply and fit testing groups of staff where a surgical mask is now considered. And then they go through the deliveries that are expected to come in, and it was the next bit really. Currently, we have 7 different types of mask in stock, approximately 2,000 staff who require repeated fit testing. Each test, as you've just said, takes between 15 and 30 minutes. And even now, with our increased fit testing offer over 7 days per week, it would take a number of weeks to test all staff on all available masks. And I know we're looking at a Leicester problem, but is that an uncommon problem, or do you think this is replicated across other trusts in other parts of the UK?
I think every NHS hospital would have had huge challenges in getting their many thousands of staff fit tested with the multiple different types of masks. And then the logistical challenges would have been huge. And we had similar problems. It was a massive logistical challenge, training challenge. It was a very difficult.
Well, if we go down the page to 4.0, what have they done, that trust, to maximise fit testing? They purchased 10 port account machines, which is the quantitative test, reducing the time from 30 to 15. They worked with colleagues to acquire additional fit testing kits. They established a team of staff trained to undertake the fit testing clinics. They identified areas where testing should be prioritised, and they indeed vulnerable staff with underlying health conditions were fit tested and provided with the PPE. So they did a number of things, but if we go over the page, please, the page 6, thank you. This is where they ended up. The purpose of this paper is to inform the board that following discussion and approval at strategic and tactical response level, the Trust has made a move away from compulsory fit testing for all types of FFP3. We've emphasised the need for a fit check at the time of donning the PPE, but essentially they wanted sign-off to move away from the need to fit test. Is that how you read this document?
That is how.
Now, I know that there is going to be controversy about this, given that you are required to fit test. If you go over the page, please, to page 7, they received what was called compliance advice, and they had taken steps to try and mitigate the testing situation, including they considered the least harm that would be obtained by releasing FFP3 national emergency stock. They set out there effectively that they acknowledge this is not in line with the standard practice outside a pandemic situation, but they considered it was consistent with the requirement under the Health and Safety at Work Act to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety and welfare at work. And they noted that we would not expect staff to work in COVID-positive areas without fit testing. So I just raised that so we can look at the interplay between the health and safety legislation and actually how it panned out on the ground. And then they asked the board to derogate from the usual requirements to fit test and revert back to fit testing as soon as supply issues. Do you think that's an extreme example, Dr. Shin, or does it demonstrate actually what trusts are having to do, particularly in April 2020 when there were supply chain issues?
So this is the only example I know where this has been applied. But as they said in this document, I think they've put a lot of thought into this in an extremely difficult and challenging situation, which they've described well. They've tried to mitigate risk as much as possible. So I think I can understand how they got to this decision that they made. And I think they took lots of reasonable steps to try and mitigate the risk. And I think reflecting on the Health and Safety Executive Guidance or instruction, that's written in the cold light of day for a non-pandemic situation. And this is in early 2020, as we've heard, was in the face of a rising tide of a very, very dangerous and lethal virus. So they were, like many hospitals, and I wouldn't be surprised if this was the only one, I'm sure other trusts had lots of difficult discussions. And I think it's a very well-reasoned rationale for changing their position to what we would like in ideal circumstances, because we were not in ideal circumstances.
No, understood. I want to ask you about those who fail a fit check and need something other than an FFP3 mask. And you include in your report reference to powered air purifying hoods. Clearly staff who couldn't find either suitably sized or it failed for reasons of beards or face shape, whatever the position may be, could use a powered hood. And you say this in your report, for these healthcare workers, such hoods were the only viable respiratory PPE option. And you say this was understood before the pandemic, but a very large number of NHS staff would fail their first fit test for a variety of reasons. Can you give us an indication of why people might fail it? Obviously, beards, face shape, but what are the other reasons that are commonly encountered?
Actually, I would say that beards are probably not the most common. So I know colleagues who shaved their beards during the pandemic. But one really significant problem, which is one of the recommendations actually, is that we found that basically these masks were designed for, stereotypical face sizes, if we can call it that, and shape. And many of our staff just don't have the, looking around the room even, you can see people have different shaped faces, especially women and persons of other ethnicities. And we found that in our workforce, and I think we said in our paper, and it's well known, most nurses, more than 80% of nurses are female. And in the NHS, we have a very diverse workforce, especially in London, we have a very particularly diverse NHS workforce. And we just found in practice, when we were scaling up this fit testing, that a lot of the people who failed their fit testing on one mask or more were female and of another ethnic, non-white ethnic background. And that's one of the recommendations that situation needs to be improved.
Yeah. I appreciate that a lot of the staff had never had to have been fit tested or needed to wear RP. But given that there was known, I think, if I understand you correctly, pre-pandemic, that there wasn't enough masks to fit the variety of face shapes that we encounter. Can you help at all as to why there wasn't sort of provision in place for being able to scale up lots of different types of masks?
I think basically the practice, this is one of the areas where our practice in the NHS changed dramatically during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we would only have had FFP fit testing for very specific areas, which I think we did mention in our report. For example, critical care, for example, respiratory medicine, and other areas similar to that, and infectious disease wards, where there's a reasonable expectation that patients with infections like TB and HCIDs could be seen. So that means this testing was only done in a very select few areas, whereas in the pandemic, because of the scale of it, it eventually expanded to most acute areas of acute hospitals, and indeed perhaps most clinical staff. So it was a question of what was needed before the pandemic was very different.
Understood. All right. Can I change topic and turn to you, Dr. Warne? And included in the report is a section entitled Controversies surrounding the transmission route of COVID and the implications for PPE. And if it helps you, Doctor, I'm at 6.10. And can I ask to be called up on screen page 64 of the report? It's 474282. _64. And would you be able to highlight the 5 bullet points? Because, if I may say, this rather encapsulates the areas of controversy that we've been dealing with. You say, however, there's been disagreement in the scientific and medical communities and a changing evidence base about the course of the pandemic related to, firstly, whether the sample size threshold of 5 microns is accurate when considering which particles are aerolized, which medical procedures are at increased risk of generating aerosols or AGPs, whether aerolized particles can be produced in the absence of AGPs, for example, through talking, coughing, sneezing, and singing. What is the contribution of aerosol transmission for COVID-19 in comparison to other routes in a hospital setting, and how the above relates to implications for IPC? In a nutshell, we've been considering some of that already, and I don't want to revisit old ground, but did you hear some of yesterday's evidence from Professor Susan Hopkins?
Some of it, yes.
All right. I'd like to ask you, please, about FFP3 versus, and that's my word, not anyone else's, versus efficacy of FRSMs. Yes. And I think you perhaps go back in time, please, to your paragraph 6.12, because as I understand it, for a long time now, there has been a distinction in IPC guidance, whether it's flu, MERS, coming on to COVID, drawn between FRSMs for routine care and respirators for AGPs. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And that's been pre-existing, I think you say, since at least 2007.
Yes.
The flu pandemic guidance was based on the assumption that flu was droplet. And so, again, FRSM was recommended for routine care, respirators for AGPs. Can I ask you this? Why do you think respirators are recommended if it was not thought that in a clinical context they necessarily offered a higher degree of protection than FRSM?
This is related to aerosol-generated procedures.
Well, no, not necessarily. Yesterday we heard from Professor Hopkins, and I asked her this: do you agree where there is an accepted risk of aerosol transmission, FFP3 should be recommended? And she didn't agree with that. She said it was complicated, and she said the evidence was weak that FFP3s protected more than FRSMs. And it made us ponder why, if the evidence was weak, there has been running throughout the guidance this distinction between FRSMs in one context and respirators in another. So that's the genesis of the controversy, and I'd like your help with how we've ended up in this position, if you're able to help us.
A lot of the evidence for this comes from SARS, so it's about 20 years old. There is no high-quality evidence as we would understand it. So in future modules, we'll talk about vaccines, we'll talk about drugs and effective treatments that undergo high-quality randomized control trials, so evidence which is considered to be of a high quality and is robust. Those kind of studies are very uncommon infection control measures. So we rely on essentially look-back exercises, retrospective, observational studies where some people had one type of infection control intervention and another group had another. So in SARS, there were a number of very small studies looking at people who had surgical masks or respirators or no PPE at all. And the evidence from SARS, based on those small studies, is that some PPE is much better than none. But very few of them actually compared respirators with surgical masks. There are 2 studies, they're incredibly small, and those very small studies, which are, by the author's admission, of poor quality. Essentially the only scientific basis at the start of this pandemic by which it is quoted in guidance from both the pandemic flu preparedness and other guidance prepared at the start of this pandemic for the rationale for using surgical masks for routine clinical care above respirators.
All right. So there is a lack of high-quality trial evidence that respirators are more effective than FRSM. Is that right?
That's right, because there is essentially no high-quality evidence.
No high-quality... Right, but there is other evidence, because we heard from Professor Veggs about the studies done in lab conditions.
Absolutely.
What about observational studies, if that be the right... Are there any other studies that help at least try and ascertain whether respirators are better than FRSMs?
There's certainly been a lot as the pandemic has progressed. Observational studies which show that FFP3 respirators or other types of respirator are associated with lower risk of transmission, particularly to healthcare workers, which are the group we're talking about. They are being criticised because their methodology is not rigorous. They often rely on retrospective observational data. There are chances of bias and so on. But that's the quality of the evidence that we're relying on, and the laboratory-style evidence, what we know a priori, what we know about the first principles of these aerosols and how they're generated, that's contributed to a body of evidence that's open to interpretation.
If there is this lack of high-quality trial evidence, can you help why it is that we've ended up now for a number of years with a distinction nonetheless being drawn between our FRSM in routine care and respirators for AGP procedures? Why have we been following this for 2 decades?
I think part of it is entrenchment, that IPC measures are very slow to change. So once you have a standard which is established 15, 20 years ago, there is very little change that happens with IPC measures, particularly at any kind of pace. So that's what we've always done. That's what we would continue to do. I
saw Professor Gould nodding there. As someone who's been involved in the educational side of things, do you have a view about what Dr. Warren's just told us?
I think by tradition, infection prevention people are very traditional, and they are not very forward-thinking people. They tend to be backward-thinking people. They tend to be, we've always done it this way, and it's the safe way, and so we'll carry on doing the safe way. They don't think it for any malicious reason. People don't dare to change. So there are some entrenched things that we do, and we do them because we've always done them, because we just don't dare to change. We always wear masks in operating theatres because we always have. Some kinds of surgery, it's probably very unlikely that transmission of infection would occur by that route, but we still wear them, just to be sure.
Can I ask you this, though, that her ladyship will see as we go through, and may indeed have an indication of it already, there were a number of calls from people like the BMA, the Royal College of Nursing, the TUC, for increased usage of FFP3 masks. Why is there this demand for FFP3 if, in fact, it makes, certainly in terms of the clinical trial evidence, little difference to the protective quality over FRSMs? Why is there the call for it?
There's certainly a perception among healthcare workers that respirators provide more protection than surgical masks.
Do you think that's basically, if you look at them, one is blue and loose-fitting, and the other one is tighter and is more robust material?
I think that's certainly there's certainly a contribution to it, but also, a lot of healthcare professionals do follow the evidence, or they are associated with professional bodies that review the evidence on their behalf. And there are, as you mentioned, trade unions, Royal College of Physicians, other bodies, where their view on the evidence was that FFP3 masks or other respirators would have provided more protection to those healthcare workers.
Yeah. What did you wear, Dr. Warren, when you were on the wards?
So initially, as was the guidance, and as I even advocated at the start of the pandemic in line with national guidance, I would have worn a surgical mask, as we have done for previous flu winters. Our trust is one of a number across the UK that moved towards respirators based on evidence that we had that respirators provided more protection for our staff. And so as the pandemic progressed, we switched to using respirators for healthcare workers caring for confirmed or suspected COVID-19 patients.
And presumably respirators in areas where AGPs were being performed?
Yes, throughout.
Can I ask you this then? If there were sufficient supplies and a healthcare worker just would prefer to wear a respirator because it made them feel safer, forget whether the lab or the science proves it, do you think that is something that should have been enabled had the supplies been there?
If I was in this position in March 2020, I think that it would be difficult to say. With the benefit of hindsight, and in future pandemics, the answer would be yes, depending on which patient group I was looking after. So for confirmed COVID patients, absolutely. For others, it's more unclear.
Can I ask you this then, please, Dr. Warren, based on the lack of high-quality trial evidence, but the other laboratory trial evidence or the observational studies, does it come to this? Do we know from the data whether FFP3 would have reduced the number of cases of COVID-19 in healthcare workers?
So we don't know that for sure. I suspect it would have reduced it by a proportion of cases. But there are other factors that contribute to healthcare workers acquiring COVID-19. So that relates to compliance with PPE, whether they would have tolerated these kind of respirators, and the acknowledgement that transmission to healthcare workers came from sources other than COVID-19 patients, including other healthcare workers, and that there were other issues regarding training and other compliance issues with PPE that need to be taken into consideration.
And given that answer, do we know from the data whether FFP3 wearing would have reduced the number of hospital-acquired infections, whether acquired by the healthcare worker or acquired by the patient?
The majority of, we'll come to later, the majority of patient healthcare-associated infections comes from other patients. So the use of FFP3 respirators by health workers is unlikely to have substantially changed the number. It may have done a small amount.
Would you recommend that the current IPC guidelines are updated to recommend routine use of FFP3?
For the care of patients with confirmed
COVID,
respiratory,
yeah.
confirmed or suspected
Or
respiratory virus?
a respiratory virus? Yeah.
Yes, I would.
Dr. Shin's got
Sorry, I'm so sorry. Yes,
To
Dr. Shin.
expand that, I think I broadly agree, but I think we also take into account the pathogenicity of the virus we're talking about. So, for example, if it was rhinovirus, which is a common cold virus, then I wouldn't advocate FFP3 for that. But yes, COVID and flu, and potentially other viruses like parainfluenza virus, there are 4 types, and immunocompromised patients can be quite seriously ill with that. So I think there's a bit of a nuance here, basically.
Understood. May I turn to AGPs, which we've touched on. I'm at paragraph 6.4, which I think is you, Dr. Warren. Can I just ask you this? We are aware that there was, during the pandemic, an independent high-risk AGP panel set up by, I think, the Chief Medical Officer, which it reported in due course. But I think you say at the outset that there is little scientific consensus on which procedures are aerosol generating. Can you just help us? Why is there no consensus about this?
So there are a number of medical procedures involving the airway or involving the upper GI tract, the mouth, the esophagus and so on, which potentially are at risk of producing aerosols and therefore potentially at higher risk to healthcare workers in the vicinity of those procedures being performed. Some of those procedures, there's little consensus on which ones produce an aerosol and why they produce an aerosol. So, for example, a number of these procedures are associated with aerosol generation, potentially because they cause coughing, so endoscopy, etc., which, as evidence has come through the pandemic and reviewed by Professor Beggs, I think, last week, that coughing is in itself probably an aerosol generating event.
Yes, I think you make the point in the report that tracheal intubation, i.e. putting the tube in, produced very low quantities of aerolized particles, but extubation, I presume taking the tube out, particularly when the patient coughed, produced detectable aerosols, which was 15-fold greater than a normal cough. Is it quite common when they're taking the tube out for a patient to effectively cough it up? I don't mean that quite as grossly as it sounded. I see. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation, there's been conflicting guidance, I think you say, between the IPC cell and other organisations in the UK as to whether that should or shouldn't be an AGP. Can you just summarise the competing arguments, if you like?
So resuscitation guidance in the UK is provided by the Resuscitation Council. One of the complications with resuscitation attempts is that they are essentially a series of interventions. So the actual chest compressions, potentially intubation, line insertion, some of which are potentially aerosol generating procedures and some of them aren't. When the initial list of AGPs was produced at the start of the pandemic, cardiopulmonary resuscitation was not on it. And that led to conflicting guidance produced from the IPC cell, from NHS, and PHE, and the Resus Council. So the Resus Council advised the use of respirators in all resuscitation attempts, and that conflicted with guidance produced by the other bodies.
May I just ask you about CPR? To the layperson, one might think of someone putting their hands on a person's chest. And does that produce aerosols, or do we know if it does?
So what you're essentially doing is forcing somebody to breathe. In any resuscitation attempt in hospital, you would have a lot of people there doing different tasks, often simultaneously. So when you have chest compressions coming on the chest, you'd also have somebody trying to intubate the patient to put a tube down, doing other procedures simultaneously. So while some of those procedures, including intubation, are concerned for adrenaline procedures, it's difficult to dissociate chest compressions, intubation, etc., because they're all happening at the same time.
I think, my lady, we're going to hear from a number of the different parties there that Dr. Warren mentioned, so I'll leave that topic there. But I think just finally, Dr. Warren, your paragraph 6.50, where you looked at a number of studies that were trying to work out which was more aerosol generating, which procedures are more aerosol generating, and what was the outcome at paragraph 6.50?
So that, as I mentioned, a number of these procedures are associated with coughing, and some of these laboratory studies that you refer to show that it's coughing that produces more aerosols. Anything that induces coughing, whether that's an intubation or if it's a physiotherapist trying to induce coughing to help somebody clear their chest, these are all likely to be associated with aerosol generation.
What about if it's not something being done to you that produces the coughing, but you're just coughing because you've got COVID and you don't feel very well?
So the evidence from these studies, which wasn't available at the start of the pandemic, is that coughing is in of itself likely to produce as much or more aerosol than many of the procedures on the list of AGPs.
And so if it is right to draw a distinction between FFP3 and AGPs, actually it's not a great distinction, because on that basis you should be having FFP3 around anyone who's coughing.
Yes, and bear in mind that 2 in 3 people who come to hospital with COVID present with coughing.
Yeah.
That's a high proportion that's a high risk, just on the general ward.
My lady, it's a little early, but I'm moving on to IPC guidelines and quite a large body of the report, and turning to Professor Gould. I wonder if that might be a convenient moment, or I can carry on if you wish and deal with some of it.
No, I'm sure the stenographer would be grateful, given some of the words that our experts have been using.
Yes.
Right, I shall return at 20 past.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Carey.
Thank you. Can we turn, please, to Chapter 3 in the report? And I think, Professor Gould, these questions are mainly going to be directed at you. And I understand that people find it difficult to hear, so I know it's not much space. Could you perhaps move your chair forward a little bit? And if anyone can't hear, I'm sure we'll get a message. Professor Gould, I suppose some background, really. It's your page 38 that we're starting at. And we've heard reference already in the inquiry to the National Infection Prevention and Control Manual, the NIPCM, which was first published in Scotland but has subsequently been rolled out across the UK. It was adopted, I think, in Wales first, is that correct, in 2018?
Yes.
In England pre-pandemic, it was Public Health England guidelines were used, is that correct?
A combination of guidelines were used,
Fine.
including public health guidelines.
Thank you. And then England moved to the NIPCM in April 2022. Is that correct?
Yes.
In Northern Ireland, Public Health Agency guidelines applied pre-pandemic. They updated their manual in 2023 and based the update on the NIPCM. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I just want to check this. Notwithstanding that NIPCM is either the manual or underpins the manuals in the respective countries, I'm asked to ask you whether you are aware that the NIPCM for England has its own governance structure, notwithstanding that it's based on the NIPCM Scotland. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
Thank you. And just for the record, we are aware that the UK IPC guidelines were published in the name of all 4 public health agencies and the Department of Health and the NHSC. At the outset, can I ask you whether you think, in your experience, consultation with stakeholders is important when developing guidelines such as IPC guidelines?
Very important indeed, because the stakeholders are the people who they will include the staff who will have to put them into place, and they will include the patients who will have to have them used on them, and the patients' families, and other groups with specific information that would wish to feed into the guidelines. So stakeholder involvement would be essential.
And at what stage would you recommend there should be stakeholder engagement?
From the outset, if at all possible.
In the room drafting the guidelines, as it were?
Yes.
How practical is that? Clearly, in pre-pandemic times, there may be more leeway in terms of pressures of time.
I think these days it would be more easily done than previously because people will do it by video conferencing. So it would be, these days, more practical.
Compliance or otherwise with the guidelines and the role of regulators. Can we just consider that, please? I think you say in your report at paragraph 3.14 that the regulatory bodies play an important role in ensuring that adequate IPC standards are in place. But I just want to be clear about what is mandatory, what is guidance, what is the sanction if you don't follow IPC guidance. So could I start with England, please? I think you said England is mandatory.
Mandatory means that you have to do it. So you would have to show that you would have to be able to demonstrate to the regulatory bodies that you had the guideline in place and that people knew what it was and where it was and how to find it. But making sure that they followed everything on it would be another story, because they would have to have the time, the resources, and all the other things that is necessary. If the hand hygiene gel is not there, you cannot use it.
We've seen, I think, in some of the IPC guidance, the words must be used, indicating a sort of mandatory. But what happens if you don't follow the guideline?
If the regulatory body comes and you are not adopting the guidelines, or you are seen to be not adopting the guidelines, then you will be penalised.
Thank you. In Scotland, you set out that the NIPCM manual has a disclaimer on it, and it reads as follows: when an organisation, for example, a health and care setting, uses products or adopts practices that differ from those stated in the manual, that individual organisation is responsible for ensuring safe systems of work, including the completion of a risk assessment approved through local governance procedures. I think there's also that wording, I think, on the bottom of the English NIPCM. Not mandatory, then. You can deviate from it, providing you've got a safe system of work, including, for example, a risk assessment. Is that how I should read that?
Yes. Healthcare is dynamic. New products, new ways of working are introduced all the time. Guideline development is complex. It is time-consuming, even if you do it by video conferencing. And you can't mandate for every occasion. So if you were going to introduce new equipment or a new way of doing something, you would have to be able to demonstrate that you had thought about infection prevention before you did it, and you could argue that what you were doing was safe and sensible.
just before you go on, Ms Carey, I may have misunderstood. I thought you said the English guidance was mandatory, the Scottish had the disclaimer, but then you added, but the English guidance also has a disclaimer.
It does have the disclaimer on the bottom of it, but it does say this should be adopted as mandatory. So perhaps that's not entirely. Let me read it out for clarity's purposes. The website on the NIPCM, on the NHS England website, states that NIPCM should be adopted as mandatory guidance in NHS settings or settings where NHS services are delivered, and the principles should be applied in all healthcare settings. Well, that's how it reads, but I think there is the caveat added. I will find it at some point in a convenient break. Can I park England for a second and ask you about Wales, please? I think you say this, the web pages for the NIPCM in Wales state that the manual, and indeed there's a care home manual, are considered best practice.
Yes, guidelines are considered best practice, the best way of doing things, but they don't talk about mandatory so much on the Welsh guidelines.
And so how does one enforce best practice?
It would sometimes be very difficult, but then it would be difficult in whichever nation you were in, if you didn't have the time or you didn't have the resources to put the guideline in practice. If you didn't have the right equipment, then it would be very hard wherever you worked.
Yeah.
And that would be the same in Wales and anywhere else.
And in Northern Ireland, the web pages state healthcare organisations may adopt this advice and guidance in health and social care trusts, primary care, private clinics and voluntary sectors. So clearly they're discretionary, not mandatory.
The Northern Ireland manual says substantially less than the other three manuals. And it's harder to draw inferences from them about what is expected, except that they are clearly drawn from the Scots ones.
Do you think that's helpful?
It would depend how much guidance you wanted. It would depend how confident you were.
Variation then in the terminology used across the four nations. Do you think that leads to an inconsistency of approach between the four countries?
There could be slight inconsistencies, and certainly it is confusing when the manual says that it's mandatory and there is a disclaimer there as well. Yeah. That's difficult.
In addition to the NIPCM and the equivalents thereof, can you also have local guidelines?
You can have local guidelines that are adopted from the national guidelines, but then there are other guidelines as well as the National Infection Prevention and Control manuals.
Yes, there are a number of guidelines I think we may look at produced by various societies, royal colleges and the like. Understood. Can you help with this? We know that during the pandemic, the regulators stopped visiting healthcare settings, in particular hospitals. Do you think that had an effect on whether IPC measures were being properly undertaken and conducted? Is that something you can help us with, Professor Gould?
I think Dr. Warren might be in a better position.
I think it's very difficult to say because any kind of visit from the regulators produces additional burden and stress on these departments who are already incredibly under pressure. I think there are other ways that you could measure infection control interventions and compliance, but bear in mind that the guidance was changing frequently. I'm not sure how useful that would have been. It's beyond my area of expertise. No.
I can remember examples from clinical practice when I was doing a research project throughout the COVID period. And I was particularly speaking to people on surgical wards. They said that parts of their ward had been commandeered for other purposes. So the room in which they normally did surgical dressings, this was a complex plastic surgery ward. Patients were at very high risk of infection, with very severe consequences if they became infected. The room which they reserved for doing the dressings in had been changed into a room where computers were present to record epidemiological data. So the dressings were being done at the bedside, And locally, the nurses thought that there were more infections as a result of that. And ergonomically, it was more difficult to do those dressings. I don't have any hard evidence of the infection rates, but that example struck, to me, it was a very interesting example, and it stuck in my mind.
The development of the guidelines, and I think you set out a summary, and then I'll work backwards if I may. But Professor, you say this: guideline development is time-consuming. It is not practical in an emergency such as a pandemic, when information is needed as soon as possible. And I think you set out in your report there are a number of ways of drafting the guidelines, but there's two I'd like to look at in particular, which is a literature review-based guideline and a rapid review-based guideline. So taking a literature review, first of all, what is a literature review?
A literature review is a summary of all that has been written on a subject. There are different sorts of literature reviews, but in this case, people will be talking about a systematic literature review, which is one in which all sources of evidence have been considered.
How long does that take?
It can take a very long time, depending on the amount of literature that has been written. So on a topic like hand hygiene, and I've been involved in the writing of hand hygiene guidelines, an enormous amount has been written. It can take you over a year. You can speed the process up if you have to, remembering that guideline development need not necessarily be a full-time occupation. Often people do it alongside, it's something you do alongside your job very often. Or you might work in a university and you might do it as part of your academic activities. But practitioners will be involved in it as well.
A rapid review?
A rapid review is supposed to be based on the literature, but is streamlined. It's an accelerated process.
And how long does it, I hesitate to use average rapid review, if there be such a thing, but how long would a rapid review take?
It's defined as something that you would do in about 3 months.
Right.
But rapid reviews, some are much more rapid than others. A lot, again, would depend on how much has been written. In some areas, in the case of Ebola, in the Ebola guideline development, in which I was not personally involved, not very much was written, and so there wasn't actually very much to review. So looking at what had been written would have occurred much more rapidly.
I've made reference there to manuals and guidelines and indeed guidance. And help us with what distinction, if any, there is between those things. Perhaps start with a guideline. How do you perceive a guideline to be defined?
Well, a guideline is usually considered to be a general outline of what should be achieved. It's usually supposed to represent best practice. Now, what you would do under ideal circumstances for everybody to avoid unwarranted variations in practice so that all patients are treated the same. So deviation from a guideline ought to be possible if you had to. For example, if a new way of doing something evolved, if a new piece of equipment was evolved, you would you'd look at the guideline, but you would use the guideline to inform what you did, remembering that the guideline couldn't be updated every 5 minutes. A manual is, infection prevention experts appear to use the word manual and guideline much more interchangeably and synonymously, but in lay parlance, a manual would be a how-to-do-it thing, rather like a recipe, rather than general principles. So a manual would tell you the different stages of a procedure and what you were doing.
Is there any difference that you can determine between a guidance and a guideline?
As far as I can see, and I have tried to find the difference between them, they are used synonymously.
Now, help us please, Will, if you wouldn't mind, Professor, with your paragraph 4.4, where you set out the WHO criteria for developing IPC manuals, which I think came in 2018. Can we perhaps put it on the screen? It's 474-282_42, excuse me. And if we could go to the bottom of that page and paragraph 4.4, I think the definition is set out. That's it, there we are. The WHO has published criteria for developing IPC manuals. The WHO criteria state the manual is not intended to be a prescriptive list of must-dos. Instead, it provides a stepwise approach to implementation based on the evidence and experience of what has worked in a number of settings, and introduces examples and ideas from healthcare facilities from around the world, which can be used by IPC leads, focal persons, and teams within healthcare facilities. What is a stepwise approach?
Well, first of all, I would like to point out that this manual was written with low-income countries more in mind than with high-income countries. But it seemed quite important to write about manuals, given the title of the guidance that we have in the UK. But step by step would indicate that there was more directive behind it rather than a guideline. So this kind of a manual, I think, would be telling you how to put a guideline in place. It would be saying, you have to involve stakeholders, you have to go through these processes. But it wouldn't be, I think, like a recipe book, remembering that these manuals would have to apply in Africa, in other parts of the world that would be very different.
And you say the WHO advocates a clear sum of its core components, identification of barriers, practical solutions, and then this, and the importance of winning hearts and minds. And you say the phrase hearts and minds is used to describe, is that a quote, convincing narrative that must be put in place? Why is it a question of winning hearts and minds?
Because emotionally and intellectually, people need to accept that the guideline genuinely does represent best practice, that it is based on evidence that is of the best quality where that evidence exists. And people have to want to do it, and they have to feel emotionally able to do it. If they're given a guide, if people are instructed to do something and they feel that it's not right, then they still may not follow it. They may improvise, they may do something different, or they may simply not adopt the guideline at all.
When dealing with something, though, as fundamental as infection prevention and control, I understand the desire to win the hearts and minds battle, but is it not just a case of do what you're told because that's what the guidance tells you to do?
People don't behave like that. Sometimes they can't follow the guidance if they don't have the right equipment anyway.
There are, as we alluded to earlier, a number of guidelines produced by NICE, professional bodies, UK IPC cell. You say in your report there are differences in the way that various bodies produce and generate guidelines. And we've touched on already the use of randomised controlled trials and why they are considered the gold standard. Are they relevant when it comes to looking at the UK IPC cell guidelines or not?
They're relevant, but infection prevention interventions are public health interventions. Randomised controlled trials were developed to test pharmacological interventions, such as vaccines, such as drugs. And there, the intervention is aimed at individual people, whether the person getting the drug gets better or otherwise, is protected by the vaccine or otherwise. Whereas infection prevention and control guidelines are really public health interventions. And it's much more difficult to subject those to randomised controlled trials. You can do it, but there will be more flaws.
We're speaking now about the kind of evidence that might underpin a guideline, and I think you say this in your report, that professional groups view evidence differently. Medical staff tend to be interested in how evidence has been generated and value evidence derived from findings of randomised control trials. Nurses appear to be more interested in how evidence can be used to support practice. They place less evidence on how it is generated than doctors. Does that not cause a slight disconnect when one thinks about winning hearts and minds? The nurses just want to be told what to do, but the doctors want to understand how we've ended up in this position.
I don't think nurses necessarily want to be told what to do. I think that they do like to think. But I think one does have to look at the difference between the preparation of medical staff and nursing staff. Medical staff have a much longer preparation time. They learn much more about epidemiological matters. They learn much more about evidence-based practice and research. A medical degree takes 5 or 6 years to complete. A nursing degree takes 3 years, and half of that is spent in practice placements. The other 3 years is theory. There is input on evidence-based practice in a nursing course, but it cannot be at the same high level that doctors have. And nurses don't necessarily have the scientific background always. This is a generalisation, but it's it's quite a lot harder, I would say, to teach evidence-based practice to nurses and to doctors. And I have done both. In my last job at Cardiff University, I taught the medical students evidence-based practice. Since the pandemic, I have taught nurses evidence-based practice. It is actually quite a lot harder with nurses because you have to provide much more background material.
Understood. There are, is this correct, there is, I should say, WHO guidance on how to produce guidelines during an emergency. Is that correct? And I think you said in your report that effectively they have specific recommendations as to how guidelines should be produced. According to international standards, it should take place in 2 stages. What are those 2 stages, please?
First of all, you should do a systematic review or a review of the literature as far as you can, if that literature exists, remembering it may change as the situation evolves. And secondly, you should develop the guidelines from the review of the evidence, such as it is.
Translating that to the COVID, though, pandemic, where we're having a novel pathogen, how practically would that happen in these circumstances?
It would be challenging. It was a challenge, I think, that, it was a novel challenge, but not unprecedented, because the World Health Organization guidelines are devised not just to look at pandemics, but any kind of emergency. So in the case of upset of infrastructure to do with earthquakes or whatever, they're designed for that as well. But I think one has to realise that in an emergency situation, information is unfolding very quickly, which is why rapid reviews are often used. But the World Health Organization and other organisations are very clear about the fact that rapid reviews should not replace full-scale systematic reviews when time and resources allow.
A shortcut may be taken at the start of a pandemic then.
Yes.
But with the knowledge that in due course you should be conducting a more full-scale review. Yeah. And is there any guidance as to how soon or after the rapid review the full-scale review should take place?
Yes, the organisations are fairly clear about that. They say that after 3 months, you should update a rapid review, and a systematic review should be available in a year. The World Health Organization places that they say that there should be an interim report as well. But remembering also that when you do a review of the literature, that review is done electronically. It is possible to update the review at any time. You would simply have to run it again.
Can I ask you, please, about challenges to sort of implementation of guidelines? I think you've already told us that successful uptake depends on the frontline believing in the guidelines, presumably being clear in the guidelines, and you make the point that guidelines that refer you to another guideline or another website are not helpful, particularly in a pandemic. Were there examples of that you can think of in the IPC guidelines at the start?
There were lots of complaints throughout the pandemic that the guidelines changed. Yeah. And of course, that made it very difficult for people, but some of that was inevitable. For example, at the beginning of the pandemic, people genuinely did feel that there was this strict dichotomy between droplet spread and aerosol spread, which I think there was, I know that there was evidence that there was no such dichotomy, but it was widely held that there was. More work was done throughout the pandemic, and the guidelines had to be updated accordingly.
Now, you say this, the guidelines that instruct the user to take an additional action or decision are equally unlikely to meet health professionals' needs. This is a common feature of IPC guidance. All too frequently, users are instructed to make a risk assessment. Now, we've touched on it already in relation to the Scottish NIPCM, for example, but help us, why is it not helpful to tell people to conduct a risk assessment if that would help keep them safe?
If people had the skills and the knowledge and the expertise to do a risk assessment, that would be fine. But they might not have, or they might be so anxious that they couldn't be thinking rationally. There is risk assessment, I think, at an organisational level, when people have time to reflect among one another, and there is a risk assessment that you do at the bedside when you're all on your own in a novel situation. The guideline is in your head, but there are all sorts of things going on, and you may not be able to follow it. So reading in a guideline, go away and do a risk assessment, is not always very helpful to people.
Do you think that the IPC guidelines that recommended a risk assessment were useful?
I think that's a very broad question. I think sometimes they were probably useful and sometimes not, depending on who was reading them. When I was doing work for this, I put myself in the position of thinking what it would be like if I was still a ward sister in charge of a ward right at the front. And I think it would be very difficult. Some of the staff would be confident at doing a risk assessment and some others would not. I noticed that in his expert statement, Dr. Barry Jones said it's particularly difficult with aerosol generating procedures because, after all, the person at the bedside can't count the number of virus particles that are present, they can't see them and they can't smell them either. And so that makes life very difficult. That would be true of other hazards such as radioactivity in healthcare as well. It's not just unique to infection, but you are asking people to cope with the unknown. And remember that not all people at the front at the bedside are going to be qualified professionals who have had any infection prevention.
We've heard already that some of the IPC guidance, I think it's in January 2022, included reference, and that was the seasonal guidance, not just COVID specific, included reference to IPC measures that should be taken whether the virus was wholly airborne or predominantly airborne. Do you think reference to wholly and predominantly is helpful to the nurse on the front line?
Well, they're vague terms. You can't really quantify them.
Speaking of which, may I ask to be put up on screen, please, INQ 421245 and the language used? Because we have an answer to your ladyship's query. This is the NIPCM for England. And if we could just scroll down, it sees the aims are to provide an evidence-based practice manual for those involved in care provision in England. And should guidance in NHS settings or settings where NHS services are delivered and the principles that should be applied. If you go down to the audience and target groups, there's further reference to should be applied. And if we could go over the page to page 2, and at the bottom of the page, I think it is, when an organisation, e.g. an NHS trust, uses products or adopts practices that differ from those stated in this manual, it is responsible for ensuring safe systems of work, including the completion of a risk assessment approved through local governance procedures. So not dissimilar to this disclaimer on the bottom of the Scotland one. I suppose it comes back to her ladyship's question. How helpful is it to have, on the face of it, what looks like mandatory guidance, but then a disclaimer on page 2? Is that useful? Is it confusing?
Potentially, of course, it is confusing, but I think you have to have the disclaimer because healthcare is dynamic, because new ways of doing things, new equipment are introduced, and no guideline can ever cover every eventuality. Something different is always going to happen. Something unique, or you can't. You could take all day, you could take all year. You cannot cover for every eventuality.
Having looked at some of the terminology and the advantages and disadvantages of having mandatory and a disclaimer allowing for a deviation from practice, do you think that the guidelines were effective at ensuring that Black, Asian and minority ethnic healthcare workers understood the need for good infection prevention and control guidelines and took into account their perspectives?
Well, I think, again, that's a very broad question because much depends not just on people's ethnicity, but on people's professional backgrounds and on the procedures that they are doing. So people's ethnicity did affect their susceptibility to infection, and there's no getting away from that. But a lot would depend on what those people were doing, whether they were qualified professionals, whether they were unqualified professionals, and what kind of setting that they were working in. So I think that you can't just look at you can't just look at ethnicity. You've got to look at all those other things as well.
I asked you about engagement with stakeholders and didn't specify which, but I assume that would include within those within healthcare workers within Black, Asian and minority ethnic.
Yes, they would.
Yeah. May I ask you about a slightly different topic and something that we've heard about called the grade framework, but we haven't really looked at it yet, and it's at your paragraph 4.36. It might be helpful to just put that up on screen, actually, but you say it's a structured approach is advocated when formulating guideline recommendations, and ideally it should involve the use of an evidence-to-decision framework. And could we put up, please, 474-282_49, which is Professor Gould's report. And paragraph 4.36 at the bottom there. A structured approach is advocated, and then there's reference to the grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluations, brackets grade, being the most widely used framework. And it identifies 4 levels of evidence: very low, low, moderate, and high. Can you help us with grade and how evidence might be upgraded or downgraded and how it impacts with the guidelines?
Yes. If you look at the evidence that's come out of the literature review, you have to have a method of... You can't just look at the literature review and pick out individual points and say, well, I like that, and so I'm going to put that in my guideline. It has to be auditable, so people have to know how you reached your conclusion. It has to be clear to other people. It has to be transparent to everybody taking part and to the people who are going to use that guideline and have it used on them. You would look at the guideline. The guideline might say everybody needs to wear a high-grade face mask. That would be based on the findings of high-quality evidence, just supposing it existed. But then it might be very difficult to provide everybody with a high-quality face mask because they might just not be available. So you would downgrade that recommendation, but you would have to say why. Some recommendations might not be acceptable to all people. And so you would have to, you would have a discussion in your group, in your discussion group, about why you thought that something wouldn't be acceptable, and that would be where stakeholders would come in. Stakeholders might say, well, this would be desirable, but ordinary people won't do this because of whatever reason. So you can upgrade or downgrade your recommendation, but you have to show how you reach that conclusion.
Could you speak a little more slowly, please?
Yes,
Sorry.
I'm so sorry.
It's all right, no, we all do it.
Show you're working.
Yes, you have to show how you got there.
Now, you say some recommendations might not be acceptable to all people. Can you think of an IPC measure where there might be unacceptability to some people?
Yes. IPC guidelines state that alcohol hand rub should be used in the clinical situation to prevent the spread of bacteria and viruses. But if somebody touched something very dirty, they might emotionally think it would be nicer to use soap and water. So they might very well do that instead of using alcohol hand rub. There have been cases where new policies of infection prevention and control have been introduced into NHS trusts. People have introduced a new disinfectant. And people have said, no, I like the old one, and I'm going to bring in the old one from home. And people do.
You make the point in your report that no matter how rigorously undertaken systematic reviews are, they might not yield the required evidence. And so how are guidelines drafted and come into being where there isn't a body of evidence following a literature review?
Where there isn't a body of evidence, then you would rely much more on expert opinion. If you can't have the results of randomised controlled trials, you would go down lower in the hierarchy of evidence to look at retrospective cohort studies, as we've heard already, or you might look at case series analyses. But even where they may not exist, they very likely don't in the case of infection prevention. So you would call on professional experts and lay stakeholders who'd had experience of the infection and ask those people for their expert opinion. But expert opinion is not the same as evidence.
So turning to the COVID pandemic then and the guidelines at the start, are you able to help us with, there's guidelines that came out in March 2020, put the HSID ones to one side from January, but by March 2020, were those guidelines based on literature reviews or rapid reviews? Can you help?
They were based on rapid reviews.
And in your opinion, was that an acceptable practice given the emergency nature of the situation we were in?
At the beginning of the pandemic, I think there was no help but to use rapid reviews. People had to use the information that was there, and they used information from pre-existing respiratory infections, predominantly SARS and MERS. But as the pandemic wore on, then I think that those rapid reviews could have been better updated. What happened was that rapid reviews were generated a lot of the time or were added to, but no full-scale systematic reviews took place.
And when do you say that should have happened?
Well, according to the guidelines that come from the World Health Organization and other organizations, after about 12 months.
Well, that would take us to March 2021, where we would have been through wave 2.
Yeah.
Is there any merit, do you think, in the guidelines being reviewed in the summer of 2020 when there was a lull, my word, perhaps not the scientific one, between wave 1 and wave 2 starting?
It would have been, if there was a lull, it would have been a good opportunity for people to have used their time, if they had any, to produce guidelines or to think about guidelines.
Can I ask you, please, about High Scotland and rapid reviews? And I think you are aware that they had conducted a number of rapid reviews, and some of those rapid reviews were appended to IPC cell minutes.
They were.
Did you have any concerns about the use of the High rapid reviews being used by the UK IPC cell? I
had reservations about it because of the way that those rapid reviews were undertaken, and that they weren't updated as they should have been.
Right. Help us with that. What were your concerns? Why did you have them about the High rapid reviews?
They were undertaken in a manner that wasn't very comprehensive or systematic. They were undertaken predominantly by one or two people. A limited amount of it. When you do a review of the literature, you look at a number of databases. Many databases exist. They looked at a restricted number of databases, and some of the databases that were omitted were ones that would have contained key information, particularly about transmission. I could talk for quite a long time. Stakeholder opinion as far as I could see, wasn't taken into consideration. It would be difficult in the middle of a pandemic to include stakeholders, but something could have been done. The presentation of the guidelines was quite difficult as well. That was perhaps not such a problem with the IPC cell as it was for people trying to put the guidelines into practice.
And in your report, I won't go to it, but you set out at Table 1 at page 54 summaries of evidence and recommendations for the High Scotland rapid reviews produced. Can I ask you this, though? I think you said that there is little detail that was provided about the processes used by High Scotland to search the literature, select the works, critique them, resulting in a lack of the convincing narrative that the WHO guidance advocated. It resulted in maybe a lack of trust expressed by health professionals themselves and their representative bodies.
Yes, if guidelines and reviews are not undertaken in a systematic way, if they take place quickly in a piecemeal way, they're more likely to contain bias. They're more likely to be influenced by other factors than the ones that we're looking at. And health professionals did realise that. They did realise that shortcuts had been taken. Some shortcuts are more permissible than others, and it's not a very good idea to go on repeating the same shortcuts. And I think that people thought that more comprehensive literature should have been reviewed, and they would have had more faith if they didn't. Having said that, I think it would be fair to say that people's reactions were often very emotional, but nevertheless, intellectually, people didn't always trust the guidelines.
Now, that brings me on to your work, Professor. I think in 2021, when you were commissioned by the Royal College of Nursing to conduct an independent review of IPC guidelines. Help us with what were you asked to look at and why were you asked to look at the guidance?
I was asked by the Royal College of Nursing, the RCN, specifically to look at the RHI guidelines. I wasn't asked to look at anything from NERVTAG. I wasn't asked to look at anything from the IPC cell. I was specifically asked to look at the most recent RHI guideline, which was the one that was produced in February that year, I think February the 5th. And I was asked to look at it in detail and to look at the methods that were used to construct it.
And when you looked at it, what did you conclude?
It didn't look like, it didn't resemble what I was expecting.
In what way?
It wasn't of the quality that I would have expected, given it certainly wasn't of the quality of systematic review, but it wasn't of the quality of a well-conducted, accelerated review either. The methods weren't described in any very great detail, and it was very hard for me to work out exactly how the information contained in it had been reached.
Can I ask you this? I understand the arguments you make about driving effectively the reader to the conclusion that it makes, but do you think perhaps there is an over focus here on how you get there? If you get to the right result, does it matter in an emergency how you get there?
But in an emergency, you don't know what the right result is, so you don't know.
And so in relation to the RHI Scotland review, do you think they got to the wrong result because they hadn't followed the right process?
Some of the time I think that they did.
Now, how did that affect, if at all, the UK IPC cell guidance?
It would be hard to know.
Right.
Because I looked at the IPC guidance in the documents that I was sent, but it would be hard to look at how they were. A lot of it documented conversations that appeared to have taken place very quickly. In looking at them, I never found any detailed discussion. I didn't find any evidence that people have said, oh, we looked at the RHI guidance on such and such a day, and we've been through it, and we've reached this conclusion. A lot of it seemed to be off-the-cuff decisions. I might be wrong because I wasn't there, but that is the impression that I get.
Well, that brings me on to a rebuttal of the RCN report that you had undertaken, which was issued, I think, by NSS, so National Services Scotland. And I think they were critical of your report, saying it incorrectly assumes that the UK IPC guidance is based on the RHI rapid review. And the rebuttal also stated that the RCN report incorrectly asserts that Scotland's NIPCM is based on rapid review methodology. The origin of this statement is unclear. Can you just help disentangle the rebuttal from what you were asked to do and what actually happened?
The rebuttal didn't really make a great deal of sense to me because I had been asked to look at the RHI guidance. I hadn't been asked to look at any other, but also it itself appeared to contain incorrect information, because never in the work that I wrote for the Royal College of Nursing did I even mention the word manual. I didn't mention the National Infection Prevention Control manuals. I wasn't asked to, and I didn't mention them.
Cross purposes or cross wires, maybe?
Well, I mean, the impression that I got was that somebody had looked at what I had written and taken fright and decided that they didn't like it very much. The rebuttal was quite brief, but a lot of it didn't make a lot of sense to me.
Do you think, having been on the inside of this, that, forget the rights and wrongs, but the arguing about who was right and who was wrong was a distraction to those that were actually trying to bring in better protection for healthcare workers?
I think it probably was.
Standing back then, taking your observations about systematic reviews, rapid reviews, the need for clear guidance, in the event of the next pandemic that's novel and there isn't an evidence base, what would be your sort of summary of how IPC guidance should be developed?
It would be a good idea to have thought about what might happen before the eventuality. So it would be a good idea to be able to draw upon a panel of people who could produce this guidance and could produce it rapidly. Now, rapid reviews are problematic because nobody agrees what is a good one. 3 organisations globally, internationally, have written about rapid reviews, and their views are more or less all the same, and they all recognise that shortcuts can be taken, but they don't endorse any of the shortcuts. We would probably benefit if people could have a greater debate about what makes a good rapid review and what doesn't. The situation is complicated because what might be permissible in one situation might be not such a good idea in another. Looking at one of the criteria of a rapid review is that you only look at publications in one language. That probably doesn't matter all that much because most people aim to get their publication in an English journal, and most journals, wherever they're produced in the world, are actually published in English, which many people don't realise. But restricting the number of databases in the case of COVID probably did matter. So I think you would want to be aware, a panel of people doing this would need to be aware of the shortcuts of rapid reviews, and there would have to be a group of people who are able to jump off the mark very quickly and produce guidance very swiftly. And you would need a panel of stakeholders that you could refer to as well.
So who do you say would be or should be on the panel?
You'd have to have, obviously, people who are guideline developers, who are technically expert, but you would need to have technical experts in the type of infection as well that you thought it was, and you would need to have people there who are going to put the guidelines into practice, which would be practitioners in the various groups, and patients and families as well, lay representatives, and people from the professional bodies.
Why do you include in it the patients and families?
Because they are going to have the guidelines used on them, and they deserve a voice.
Thank you, Professor. Can I turn to some challenges in the implementation of guidance? And I think this is your area of the report, Dr. Shin, and I'm in chapter 12, if it helps you. We've obviously already considered with Professor Gould just there some of the terminology and how helpful or otherwise that is. But can I go back to basics and when a new guideline came out, how was that communicated to the trust, the hospital, and then indeed the staff who had to implement it?
So there was a now well-rehearsed method. So it came out basically from a national body, be it NHS England or UKHSA, previously PHE. It would then be, in England, it would then be transmitted to a regional organisation, for example, NHS England, London, for example, and then to the NHS Trust within that region, say London, for example, and then to...
So it goes national, regional...
And then hospital.
Hospital. And is this, we saw yesterday a CAS communication, a central alerting system. Is that how it was, you were alerted to the fact there was guidance coming?
That's one method.
Right.
We've had some recently, but there are other methods too, for example, IPC networks. And another complication is that in England, NHS systems are now organising bodies called integrated care systems, of which London has 5, for example. And that's another way of cascading information. So in terms of cascading, there's no reason to be concerned about that, because information will definitely get cascaded. Once it reaches a hospital, then it would arrive, for example, something like my desk or my colleagues, and cascade internally mainly within senior leadership, and then we discuss how we can implement that, whether we can implement that, and also when. And then we work closely with our communications colleagues, make sure it gets cascaded out through the formal communication methods, which might be emails, daily bulletins, but also through professional networks within the hospital, for example, matron huddles, through all staff, or, for example, all consultant emails, that kind of thing.
So pausing there, if you got some guidance that came out on a Friday afternoon, and we've heard a number of examples of that, indeed we saw one coming out at 4:43 on a Friday, what do you practically do as the dipsy?
Get a large cup of coffee, I think. This was a feature which many witnesses, and many of our colleagues at the time, it did occur quite frequently. I'm not quite sure why it has to come out on a Friday. it was difficult because on a Friday everyone's preparing to go home, so we would stay and deal with it and have those conversations I've described as quickly as we can, and then probably deal with it more completely on Monday morning to generate a plan on how we would cascade that. Sometimes the guidance was quite urgent and maybe really important new information came out, and we would have to cascade it as best we can, potentially on a Friday evening.
So we were looking yesterday at the acute shortages guideline when there was a shortage of gowns, and that came out at 4:43 on a Friday afternoon. How did you get that down to the staff that weekend?
That kind of example would be done with difficulty. We would have on-call teams, site management. In our hospital, I'm sure many others, there are weekend operational meetings, which I attended during the pandemic, and we just have to use every method we can to get the message out. But that Friday afternoon, evening is just not a good time to disseminate this kind of guidance.
I don't know if there was ever a good time to disseminate the acute shortages guidance.
On those particular examples, I can understand. But a lot of the time, when you look at the guidance, it's not clear. It was not clear to me and many of my colleagues why it was so urgent. It had to come out on a Friday afternoon. But that example you gave, yes, I can see why that's urgent.
Would it have made a difference if it came out at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning in the pandemic?
For that particular example, that would have come out whenever the need arose. But there are other times where there was changes in, pathways, for example, and why that was so urgent to come out on a Friday afternoon was not always clear.
Do you think it would have made a difference to you on the ground if it had come out on a Monday morning?
It just made implementation easier and be less stress for all staff, and maybe less stress, less confusion. Because one of the things we discussed was how can we get this out clearly to the right people at the right time. And if you're doing it all in a rush and a panic on Friday afternoon, when emergency departments are often traditionally quite busy anyway, and also staffing at weekends and evenings is less, it's just not a good time to implement guidance. But when it is urgent, like the example you gave, then that's understandable. But short answer, yes. It's just not a Friday. Just don't do it on a Friday afternoon, basically.
I think we've got that message. Help us with this, though. Putting aside when the guidance came out, there were clearly lots of different pieces of guidance. And do you think that having so many iterations of the guidance was confusing, or is it just something that has to happen as science evolves and supplies evolve and the guidance changes?
I mean, in a way, the answer is all of the above. I mean, if the evidence changes significantly, as we've heard, then it's right and proper to generate and cascade correctly formatted guidance. But there was some, in reading the documents in our report and preparing for this, there were occasions where, when new iterations came out, it was quite hard to see the differences. And later on in the pandemic, it was highlighted which bits changed. But sometimes the changes were quite subtle. So it did beg the question sometimes of why does this version need it?
Can you give us an example? Or if you can't,
hard to give a specific one, but sometimes
want to have a think over lunch, and we might return to that.
Potentially.
Yeah. The reason I ask is this: that there's a question mark a number of core participants about having so many versions of the guidance might have made it confusing for the staff having to implement the guidance. Do you have any observations on that comment?
Yes, I mean, you see it and also in non-COVID examples as well, where when we disseminate guidance, it's quite common for people to print it out and stick it on a wall on the ward. And so you can easily see how you can easily end up with the old version. So we tend to discourage, officially we discourage printing, or we disseminate everything's electronic these days, as we've discussed. But on wards where it's busy, having a notice on the wall is one way of communicating to staff. But that can easily become out of date.
I think you were made aware of a problem in Wales, where at some point during the pandemic, actually Public Health England guidance started coming out on a Thursday, but Public Health Wales guidance came out the following Friday, causing unnecessary level of anxiety through the staff because they weren't sure whether the Thursday guidance was then going to be made to come in Wales. Do you have any views about whether there should be a unified approach to the announcement of new IPC guidance?
Between devolved administrations, do you mean? That I can't I find it hard to comment on, but I can give examples even within England or even within London.
Please do.
Where if there's cascading in slightly different rates, we have many colleagues have maybe partners or family members or friends who work in other hospitals, and they may have implemented at a different rate or speed, and also may have differed in the degree to which they adopted the guidance. And that has a lot of that was done related to PPE, for example, and that has led to difficult conversation about, well, the hospital down the road is doing it this way, and why are we doing it this another way? Or they did this last Thursday, and why are we doing this on Tuesday? So those kind of conversations. So I think a bit more uniformity of the way it's cascaded would be helpful. But I'm not saying that happened by any design. Probably is more done by accident.
And how did you deal with that?
So coming back to the integrated care system, one example where this was helpful is that we had a network with IPC of DIPSIs, and I'm sure there are other professional groups as well. So when one of these major guidance changes arrived, we would quickly, basically email each other or phone each other, say, this is what's come, this is the recommendation, how are you going to deal with this? That didn't mean that we all had to adopt the same thing at the same time, but it was important, it was helpful to be aware that another hospital might do it slightly differently, so that when we get that feedback from staff that, well, that hospital's doing that differently, we're aware of it and we have some kind of logical reasoning, hopefully, to explain the difference.
I wanted to ask you about feedback, actually, because if you got feedback that a guideline had come out but wasn't helpful, didn't work in practice, is there any system in place for you relaying back to NHS England in this example that just doesn't work for us?
This is for the if I can call it ICS because it's quicker.
Integrated care system.
Integrated care system, ICS. We had some mechanisms through links of NHS England and UKHSA to feedback, but we didn't. When we did that not much expectation it would change anything, but we just a feedback that we felt this was difficult to implement. But if in each hospital we made decisions, come back to the local risk assessment, made decisions about to what extent we can implement that guidance.
Can I ask a slightly broader question? We looked at some of the problems the terminology used in IPC guidance can cause, predominantly wholly and the like. But do you think that routes of transmission do have a role in IPC guidance? And it may be one that all three of you would like to consider. But starting with you, Dr. Shin, do you think it should set out, we think it's droplet-borne or maybe aerosol-borne or might be contact?
I think differentiation for contact transmission and the other methods, the other routes of transmission, that is an important distinction. I think many of us will be aware, perhaps everyone's aware, the WHO is kind of advocating for more simple nomenclature, so just airborne, and moving away from as we've heard, the very complicated technical difference between droplets and aerosols and particle sizes, etc., which Professor Begg's report is an excellent summary of. So I think contact versus airborne would be a useful distinction. Now, talking about people being entrenched, I grew up as a virologist with droplet and aerosol, and I think the fact is that particles are of different size, so that is not. It is valid to talk about that from a virological perspective and maybe an academic perspective, but from a point of view of deploying this on the wards in our hospitals, I think a simplification of the nomenclature would be helpful to avoid the confusion and all the unnecessary debate. And confusion on the front line would be the last thing we want. So even though I've got reservations about moving to just calling it airborne, I think from a delivering good IPC practice, protecting staff and patients, moving to the terminology of airborne is a reasonable compromise and step to take to try and avoid confusion that we've experienced in this pandemic.
Professor Gould, can I ask you, since you're an educator of people that have to use the IPC guidance, do you have any views on this?
I think simplification would be a good thing, particularly remembering that many people who deliver care on the front line are unqualified support staff in any case, and they will not have had any formal preparation in infection prevention at all. So a simplification would be very useful.
Given, though, that we have standard IPC measures and then the transmission-based, doesn't there need to be some reference to the mode of transmission?
Yes, I think that there does. Whether something is spread by direct contact or through the air is important. And remembering also that most infections that are spread in hospital that cause problems on a day-to-day measure are spread predominantly by hands and by contaminated surfaces.
Any agreement or disagreement from you?
I do agree, and I would just add that we've just as laid out in the report, there are downsides of wearing respirators. So for pathogens where there is no risk of an airborne route, so for example MRSA, we should have separate contact and airborne precautions.
Yeah. Well, can I turn to adherence or lack thereof? And I think this may still be you, Dr. Shin. In paragraph 12.7 in the report, I think set out there that there was anecdotally reports of incomplete adherence to recommended RPE by clinical staff. You acknowledge that it would have varied greatly across the NHS, but the reasons for that might include lack of training, variable quality of the training, perceived lack of PPE supply in the organisation, lack of confidence in the recommended PPE, and you say there's varying social pressure to adhere to PPE policy. What did you mean by that?
I think the best way to respond to that is that I think missing that list, an important factor affecting adherence was basically the discomfort related to RPE. And I think that would be a big factor. I find it ironic that when we had lower levels of expected face coverings or PPE or RPE, when there was pressure to move to respirators, and then we responded to that. And when we did change to respirators because our ventilation was poor, there was then pushback asking us to move in the other direction because people were finding RPE so uncomfortable. It's physically uncomfortable, it's tight, breathing is difficult, communication is difficult, and as we said in our report, and I don't know if we're coming on to separately specifically, but quite a few staff experienced skin lesions, pressure, pressure sores where you've got prolonged apparatus on your face, quite tight, and it can, and quite a few staff experienced this, lead to pressure sores on the nose, which is very uncomfortable, risk of infection, and potentially quite serious. So I think those are the factors, and many staff reported feeling headaches after using prolonged usage, which you can understand why that affected adherence. But it was kind of a lose-lose. When we had lower standards of RPE, there was pressure to move up, and then when we adopted it, there was pressure to move down. So
did you say lose-lose or being caught between a rock and a hard place?
Lose. Yeah. Yes, rock and hard place.
In the report, you set out that there was a survey conducted in 2020 of over 1,000 UK healthcare workers. They found self-reported adherence to PPE to be 80%. Adherence was greater in the older healthcare workers in situations where PPE supply was good and where PPE training was perceived to be good. Do you have any observations on why it would be that older healthcare workers were more adherent than the younger ones?
I think this brings us to another factor which can influence adherence. As you've heard earlier today, it was also linked to the perceived risk to the user. So we quickly knew in the pandemic that older persons were at greater risk of more severe disease, and age was a significant, I think it's over 50 was a cutoff. So it doesn't surprise me that older staff who felt a greater perceived risk themselves had a greater adherence to RPE.
We have referred a number of times now to challenges in rolling out IPC, and I think you reference in the report the size of the IPC teams, and I'm at your paragraph 12.12, but I think you say in your experience, large teaching hospitals tend to have IPC teams of adequate size and expertise in non-pandemic times, but even those relatively well-resourced IPC teams were stretched during the period. Give us an example, perhaps, of your hospital, Dr. Shin. How big is the IPC team in your hospital?
So,
or your trust, if that's
in my trust, we have, as myself, we have a nurse-led team. It's approximately 15. Just change from time to time. Approximately 12 to 15 nurses, IPC nurses of varying seniority, from very senior to colleagues who've just joined us. I'm glad they have joined us. We also have, I think, probably the relative luxury of an epidemiologist who only deals with IPC matters and was very helpful with generating data during the pandemic, but also before the pandemic and on non-COVID matters. And we also have, for example, analysts, I've talked about analysts, data analysts who deal with, for example, audit data, surgical site infection data, so not necessarily COVID related. In addition, we have subject matter experts. We have 2 infection control doctors who are consultant microbiologists and infectious disease physicians, and we have support from consultant virologists, so my colleagues in virology. So it's quite a sizable.
Yeah, and how many people is that trying to roll out IPC? How many patients have you got in your trust? Give us a...
We have approximately between 1,000 and 1,100 beds. It does fluctuate slightly. So it's approximately 1,100 beds.
It gives us an idea.
Yeah.
There are obviously challenges during the pandemic to the supply and distribution.
Sorry, just before you go on to that.
Sure.
Dr. Shin, you're a large London teaching hospital. So, dare I say, I'm going to assume that the NHS, other hospitals around the country aren't quite as well staffed by IPC experts, or?
I mean, it would be proportionate, but I think we are relatively well resourced, and I think most London teaching hospitals have similar resource. I'm sure it will vary a lot, but I think there'll be smaller non-teaching hospitals which have maybe disproportionately smaller teams. So I think there will be quite a lot of variation across the country, but I can't speak to exact details.
Thank you.
Challenges in relation to supply and distribution. And I think you say between the 3 of you, you have no personal experience of PPE supplies not arriving or being exhausted in your NHS trusts. You're not aware of any examples of specific NHS trusts running out of PPE. Some specific products ran out, if I understand it correctly, but alternative PPE was sought and supplied. But you are aware of the concerns outside of your trusts. I see nods from both you and Dr. Warne. And can I ask you, please, about a survey conducted, I think, by the BMA, the RCN, and the Royal College of Physicians. And could we have up on screen, please, INQ 474282_128. And could we highlight figure 14, please? I'd just like your help, Dr. Shin, with what the survey found. I think it was conducted in 2020. And it set out the findings of the 3 different groups contributing to this. But do I take it that if we take eye protection, that in high-risk environments, the Royal College of Nursing that reported that 22% of the people responding had difficulties obtaining eye protection. Am I reading that correctly?
So that's correct. That's the respondents from frontline healthcare workers, so the nursing team in that regard. Yeah.
And then it speaks for itself going down in a high-risk environment. What do you understand that to mean? An AGP hotspot?
Exactly.
All right. Seemingly no issues with face masks in high risk.
I suspect that was because it wasn't included in the survey, or actually in that particular regard, because respirator masks would have been recommended rather than face masks.
Yeah.
Hence, it's not relevant to that.
Right. There were reports of difficulties with respirator masks across all 3 contributors to varying degrees. No training on safe donning and doffing, putting on and taking off was a problem. And then a distinction drawn between an environment with possible or confirmed cases, presumably to mirror the distinction in the IPC guidance. Is that how you read it?
Yes, so there's been people caring for confirmed or possible COVID cases, but not in an AGP environment.
And there were reports of insufficient PPE in relation to eye protection across all 3 contributors, plus now Unison had responded to parts of the survey. Face masks and indeed problems with gloves. Again, some gaps there. Do you take the gaps because they weren't asked in the survey?
Because at that time, these items of PPE were not recommended for routine use in these environments.
Oh, yes, correct. Gown and, yeah, thank you. So although you don't have personal experience of supply issues, clearly there were reports of them from a number of significant bodies of healthcare work, representing healthcare workers. And just can I ask you sort of anecdotally, if I may, did you hear reports from your colleagues in other hospitals and trusts, Dr. Warren, of difficulties?
Yes. So first of all, there was always a perception that the supplies of PPE were always low. They were never particularly resilient in each trust, but in certain trusts, including mine, there were no reports they completely ran out. The Royal College of Physicians and others have released information about the variable quality, some of which was perceived to be not fit for purpose, that was supplied. But this is from the first wave of the pandemic, in particular in March and April 2020. And the reports on social media and various other outlets, both anecdotal and systematically collected by these organisations and others, showed concerns that frontline healthcare workers felt that the availability or quality of the PPE or the training associated with it was not adequate. But the detail on that is lacking. We don't know, the definitions here are unclear. And as referenced in the report, the National Audit Office, who surveyed some NHS providers, stated that the supply chains to those trusts, the PPE never ran out. So it's unclear why there is this disconnect between what the procurement chain is saying and what the frontline healthcare workers are saying.
Can I go back to what the human chain, as you call it, was saying about your fellow professionals? You said that there was a perception the supplies were always low, and I missed it, and I think the stenographer missed it. Did you say there weren't reports of anyone completely running out, or there were reports of hospitals?
I can't speak for any other trusts. I'm not aware of any PPE shortages of any particular items in my trust. Right. But certainly there was perception of other health workers at other trusts that there was lack of availability on the front line.
Now, Dr. Warren, you mentioned quality issues there, and it's touched on in the report because at paragraph 12.18, there was concern about some of the flu pandemic stockpile and the quality of FFP3 respirators. I think the report says this: this national stockpile had been built up over several years for the next pandemic. Unfortunately, many NHS hospitals reported that these masks were in poor physical condition and could not be used. For example, some of the masks had begun to partially disintegrate. There was visible deterioration of the fabric and the elastic straps of these masks. And I think you wanted to add some context to that, Dr. Shin.
Yes, just reflecting on rereading the report, that's a rather probably overly black and white description. On reflection, we're aware that some trusts were in receipt of supplies of these pandemic stockpile respirators, which were of acceptable standard and were used. But it reminded me and our colleagues that one of the controversies at the time was that a lot of the stock was actually time expired, and many recipients found that new expiry date stickers have been applied, which undermined confidence in that PPE. But
so it said it expired in 2015, and here you were in March 2020 with a new stamp on it.
Yeah.
Was it communicated to healthcare workers that although a new stamp had been applied, it was therefore approved? Had that message got through?
I recall some communications about that, but how clear that was, I'm not certain.
And just finally on this topic, we've been looking at problems in relation to masks and other PPE, but can I ask you about respiratory hoods? I think you say there that there is a challenge in relation to those. What are the challenges in relation to respiratory hoods?
So there are multiple challenges. Again, come back to logistics. Trusts and hospitals probably had very small numbers of them, if any, and they would have had to purchase potentially significant numbers. We bought a few hundred, and so was everyone else. That's one challenge. Two, you'd need to train staff on how to use them. They're actually quite complicated piece of equipment. They have a hose to a pump and a filter with a power supply. So they've got bulk, they're heavy, and if you look at them, they basically surround the head. So that's not good for communication from verbal, maybe even non-verbal communication. And they're often used, for example, in critical care. As an example, I'm aware of they're being used quite widely. And in that setting where they've got lots of very sick, acutely ill patients, deteriorating patients, any impediment to communication between team members is probably not ideal at all.
I think you say they also They need to be cleaned after each use,
Absolutely.
and they need to be maintained, not just cleaned.
Exactly. So all of these things, when you can view these PAPR hoods as the solution to this problem of staff not getting fit tested or unable to find a mask, but although they bring that PPE protection for that episode of giving patient care, they bring with them a lot of attendant behind-the-scenes challenges which are not evident when you first reach for this as a solution.
Yeah. My lady, I'm moving on to a different
Yes, of course.
topic. Would that be a convenient moment for lunch?
I shall return at 25 to 2. Once Ms Carey's finished with her questions, obviously they're questions coming from core participants, could I ask each advocate who's been given permission to ask questions, to work out which expert would be best able to deal with their questions? Otherwise, the questions are going to come at the experts and we're not going to know who's meant to be answered.
If I can assist, I'll happily do so.
Yeah, if you can, it's just that it might be easier for the experts and
Quite.
easier for me.
Yeah.
Thank you. 25 to 2, please.